Hello and welcome to part 2 of the East and Southeast Asia notes. So let's get started. Japan since about the year 1750. Okay. So, 1800s, Japan is still largely in its feudal system. Hopefully you learned that in Global 1 last year, where you have the shogun. You technically have the emperor at top, but in reality the person who ran the government was the shogun, and usually the shogun was held by one family, the Tokugawa family, and they call it the Tokugawa shogunate for that reason. And that largely ruled the Japanese government from the 1600s to the mid-1800s. So during this time period, the Tokugawas and the shoguns, they isolated Japan from especially the West because there was growing Christian influence in Japan, so they cut off all Western influence. Okay, almost all Western influence, with the exception of the Dutch were allowed to trade in exactly one port in Japan, but largely cut off from outside influences. So significant change occurs when an American admiral, so like a one-star admiral in the American Navy, his name was Matthew Perry, Commodore Matthew Perry, has a letter in his back pocket, and that letter was written by the President of the United States at that time. His name was Millard Fillmore, and he was instructed to go to Japan and open Japan for trade. And the way they did this was by saying, hey, open for trade with the United States, or else. You look at this huge line of American ships with large cannons, and if you say no, goodbye Tokyo Harbor. So they effectively opened Japan through the means of force. So after the Americans are allowed to trade in Japan, we're going to see other Western powers do the same. So the treaty to know that opens Japan to trade with the United States is called the Treaty of Kanagawa, and that forcibly opened Japan to trade. Okay, and then fast forward about 10 years, and we have a new Japanese emperor. His name was Emperor Meiji, which loosely translates to the Enlightened One or the Enlightened Way. So with Emperor Meiji, here's usually the first words that pop into my brain. It's modernization, industrialization, some forms of westernization as well. So he's going to take the country from a feudal society to a modernized country, eventually having one of the most powerful militaries in the world. And that military is what's going to take over a good portion of East and Southeast Asia in the 1930s and 1940s. So the Western models they're going to adopt is they're going to adopt some forms of their governments, like they are going to eventually have a representative representative parliament, although in reality the emperor is still at the top, and then really it's his ministers, especially his war minister, who will really kind of control the government. They abolished the samurai class completely. They made it illegal to carry a sword in public. They're going to use a conscript army. So historically, peasants are not going to be like an important part of the Japanese military in the feudal system. Now they're going to conscript former peasants, train them how to use rifles, and become a powerful military that will eventually defeat a Western power like Russia in 1905. So going back to Global 1, one of the generalizations they hopefully made was Japan largely has a limited amount of natural resources like coal, like iron. So usually a country gets that one of two ways. It's trade, or in this case, they're going to follow the Western approach, which was colonization, imperialism. So we're going to see that take place fairly soon. Okay, so a major war to know when it comes to Japanese imperialism. I usually like to talk about the Russo-Japanese War, which really puts Japan on the map of being a world power. They defeat Russia, and that's going to be like their starting point to gain a significant foothold in Eastern Asia. So basically what Japan's going to do is first take over Korea, Manchuria, and then all the way down the east coast of China by the 1930s. Okay, so this is just a list of Japan taking over a lot of land in East Asia. We've already covered this in AP Euro, so this should actually all be review. Second Sino-Japanese War is referencing the Japanese invasion of China. And basically, major things to know: when the United States declares war against Japan after Pearl Harbor, it's kind of like the beginning of the end for the Axis powers, and World War II in the Pacific theater, ending with the 2 atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Okay, so post-World War II Japan. So this is the stuff that's actually new for us. The United States wrote Japan a constitution. And a major article to know is Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which effectively states that the Japanese cannot use their military for offensive purposes. It can only be used for defensive purposes. Even the official name of the Japanese military has the word defense in it. So they can't just like declare a war and invade a country, obviously referencing their expansionism in the 1930s. So that is actually still in effect with the Japanese Constitution today. So the other aspect of the Japanese Constitution, it made the Japanese emperors, the royal family, officially remove their belief that they were descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu. So they're kind of like secularizing the government to a certain extent as well. Okay, some other things to note is Japan is going to have a similar economic miracle that West Germany had post-World War II, and it's all going to be focused on industrialization, especially technology. Automobiles are going to be huge. So Japan, like creating Nikon, Canon, Sony, they're eventually going to take off with their, the Walkmans for Sony's case, cameras for Nikon, Canon, and Sony as well. And Japan effectively creates its own economic miracle. Honda, Toyota become international products now, not just Japanese product, like Japanese-only products. They become international. The United States, it's like the most common car in America, besides the Ford F-150, is the Toyota Camry. I love this. Oh man, the Walkman, so great. I actually used to have one when I was pretty young, but that's just an FM radio that was, fairly small. You can like attach it to your waist, put it in your pocket, and pop in some earbuds and do your thing. Yeah. What else? We had the Discman, so actually a CD player. I remember riding the school bus with my little Sony disc player, and it would always skip around because the bumps on buses are awful and would be really, really aggravating. Then they invented anti-skip technology, and it was amazing. And then they had eventually MP3s, and MP3s don't really have the issue with skipping. And here we are now with Spotify. All right, trade balance, that makes sense. Okay, it's just some other things to note. Since 1945, Japan has, as one of the strongest economies in the world, Japan's culture is gradually shifting. We're seeing a weakening of the Confucian model. For example, there is a gender imbalance in Japan as well, to a certain extent. Women are putting off marriage much longer than they have before. It's not uncommon for a Japanese woman to wait until at least 30 to get married, to have children. So that's also changing Japanese culture. And additionally, the impact of all of that is Japan is actually now on a significant population decline. And I think I have that somewhere over here. Yes, I do. So again, the issue with having a declining population that is not being made up with immigration is it puts more stress on your welfare state. So Japan actually has they're still like the #1 country in the world when it comes to life expectancy. So what's happening is the population is getting older, and since the younger populations are having fewer babies, there are now fewer people to be taxed to maintain that welfare state. So it's a pretty significant issue that Japan does need to contend with. We obviously saw that with Do It for Denmark in AP Euro. So Japan has similar issues. They've also had similar issues when it comes to terrorism. Most famous was a sarin gas attack by a essentially cult-like organization in Japan in 1995. That's actually kind of a cool video that talks about a student who is literally the only student in a rural school in Japan. So it's like just one teacher, one student, K through 12. I can't even imagine how that'd be so awkward. Man. All right, anyways, I digress. So, shifting to Korea, since 1750, this one's a little bit more straightforward, especially because we've already covered the Korean War in AP Euro. Oops, sorry, let me go back again. There we go. All right, so Korea, first thing to note, naturally resource rich, which is why Japan, China, and Russia have all had a stake in the Korean peninsula. So in particular, coal, especially number one, graphite led to a certain extent, but coal really was the key. So this brings us to the Korean War. So we know after World War II, the Soviet Union and America divided the Korean peninsula at the 38th parallel. North Korea became a communist totalitarian state under the Kim family. South was an anti-communist state, although it was still largely authoritarian. North Korea, under the Kim family, invades South Korea. They almost defeat South Korea, and then America's foreign policy of containment kicks in. The United States sends in the troops, as well as other countries from the United Nations. And they beat back North Korea. Long story short, they maintain that division at the 38th parallel. North Korea is still communist. South Korea today is a full-on democracy with one of the strongest economies in the world. And our takeaway from it is another example of a proxy war during the Cold War. All right, there's Kim Jong-un, current dictator of North Korea. So North Korea today, usually the questions I ask about North Korea involve the Korean War, but I could definitely see questions coming up about North Korea's nuclear weapons development program. So they tested their first nuclear weapon in 2006, if my memory serves me correctly, and since then have been developing intercontinental ballistic missiles. Allegedly, some of their ICBMs can hit the west coast of the United States now. So they are pushing for nuclear proliferation, while a good portion of the world is going for non-proliferation, so that's one issue to consider. Additionally, North Korea is probably the most repressive regime on Earth. They have forced labor prison camps. Those camps, the executions, are a result of millions of people being killed since the Korean War has ended. So those are just some general things to note with North Korea. And on the other hand, we have South Korea, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a full-scale democracy. So key things to know is South Korea is going to have a similar economic miracle as Japan, as West Germany, where they're going to focus on industrializations like their automobile industry, like Hyundai's, Kia's, their tech industry, like Samsung is one of the largest tech companies in the world. If actually, they might be potentially the largest. I have to see if they're bigger than Sony. Regardless, additionally in South Korea, they're becoming a much more global society. Think of the global impact of the K-pop bands. I think they are actually the highest grossing artists in the entire world when you put their economic impact. We're talking like tens of billions of dollars. So South Korea is just kind of like exporting its culture, sort of like the United States has kind of been exporting its entertainment culture. South Korea has more recently been doing that with K-pop. Another cool feature, though, noting the photograph here, in the 2018 Olympics, North and South Korea actually sent one team, not just a North Korean team, not just a South Korean team. They created just one team called the Unified Korean Olympic Team, which is kind of a cool idea. People thought it was sort of like an easing of tension, but really since 2018, I'm recording this in 2022, there's now been kind of a renewed increase in political tension between North and South Korea. So I'm interested to see if they're going to do the same thing in the next Olympics, is have a unified Korean team. We'll see. All right, Southeast Asia. Key one here is going to be Vietnam and Myanmar. So Vietnam we have also covered to a certain extent in AP Euro. So this goes back to decolonization. So after World War II, France attempted to maintain to reassert its control over French Indochina, basically Vietnam. And Ho Chi Minh, who just got done expelling the Japanese, now has to deal with the French again. So with Ho Chi Minh, the term to know with him is Vietnamese nationalist 1, and then 2 communist revolutionary as well. So after they defeat the French, as you see here, the United States is gradually increasing its troop presence because the United States wanted to support South Vietnam as an independent state because it's part of the containment policy. But North Vietnam communist invades South Vietnam. America sends in even more troops. And long story short, after a very bloody war, guerrilla warfare, you name it, the United States made a peace deal between North Vietnam, South Vietnam. North Vietnam agreed to not invade South Vietnam. And as soon as America left North Vietnam, invades South Vietnam, unifies Vietnam as one communist state, which it is today. All right, next is Cambodia. So Cambodia, the Regents exam effectively answers or asks one question about, and that involves its genocide in the 1970s. So Cambodia gains a leader called Pol Pot, and Pol Pot had a political party called the Khmer Rouge. And the Khmer Rouge was a communist political party. Pol Pot was a communist. And his goal is to create a communist agrarian society in Cambodia. And the way he's going to do this is effectively by de-urbanizing it. He basically wanted Cambodians to abandon their cities completely and live on communes in the agrarian parts of Cambodia, which admittedly is the majority of Cambodia. And like any other person engaging in genocide, they generally targeted first people they considered to be intellectuals. And Pol Pot's level to consider someone an intellectual was very low. Is if somebody had a 7th grade education or higher. Basically, can they read and write? And if the answer was well, yes, they were executed or more likely sent to one of these forced labor camps, which will eventually be labeled as killing fields. So eventually, these persecutions lead to a good portion of the country, and in these forced labor camps, at least 2 million Cambodians are murdered. And if you look at that in the percentage of population, you're talking like 30% of the entire Cambodian population was murdered in 4 years. So the genocide eventually ends when the Vietnam's military invaded Cambodia and pushed out the Khmer Rouge. Pol Pot actually escapes, and he was only caught decades and decades later, but he actually never was put towards trials or anything like that, unfortunately. But Cambodia, again, understanding the genocide, understanding Pol Pot's idea of trying to create an agricultural society, and then the killing fields leading to the deaths of 2 million people are the key ideas here. And Myanmar. So, Myanmar used to be part of the British Raj. So when Britain controlled India and Pakistan, it was not just those two countries, it was also Myanmar. But the British called it Burma, so British Burma. And like India, getting independence in 1947 for India, a year later, Burma gains its independence and renames itself Myanmar in 1989, actually. So here are the general ideas to know with Myanmar since its independence in 1948. First, you got to know the ethnic groups in Myanmar. So the ethnic majority are Burmese, and they are largely going to control the government and the military in Myanmar. There's also ethnic minorities like the Karen, like the Rohingya. And from 1948 until the 1990s, it was a full-on military junta, or military dictatorship. So, 1990, there were a series of elections. And the government allowed them. The opposition party, which is effectively the Democratic Party, at least pro-democracy party, led by a woman named Aung San Suu Kyi, they won. And the military was not a huge fan of this. So they actually rejected the results of the election. They arrested Aung San Suu Kyi, and she's going to spend the better part of 2 decades in prison. And while she's in prison, the Nobel Society awards her the Peace Prize because of her attempt to bring democracy to Myanmar. So she is released from prison and house arrest in the year 2020, and she effectively is going to usher in a short period of democracy in Myanmar. Basically, the civilian government and the military junta kind of shared powers, and we did see a form of liberalization in Myanmar's government. So during this entire period of time, the military taking over, many of the Karen, who were refugees, left Myanmar. They first generally went to Thailand, where there were many refugee camps, and those people, their descendants as well, eventually moved to the United States, and many of them moved to upstate New York, like Syracuse, Utica in particular. Ithaca has a large population as well of Karen refugees, as well as Burmese refugees as well. And it looked like Myanmar was on this path towards a more and more democratic society until 2021. So December 2021, the military overthrew the civilian government led by Aung San Suu Kyi, arrested Suu Kyi. She is still in prison to the very day. It's still the military's control of Myanmar as I'm recording this in April of 2022. So the military has stated they are going to consider elections in the near future, so we'll see how legitimate and transparent those elections will be if they do happen. Additionally, other things to note, and this was actually occurring under Aung San Suu Kyi's government as well, was the Burmese-led military was also engaging in ethnic cleansing of another ethnic minority called the Rohingya, which were a Muslim minority. And that is still occurring today, again, as I record this in April of 2022. So that's something you generally will see in the news going on right now. All right, so that is this section, part 2 of the Southeast Asia and Southeast Asia notes. The next section of notes, they're going to be fun, so stay tuned. See you later.